they asked me to do it, and I was anxious to do some live appearances. You know, it'd been a long time since I've been on stage in front of anybody live. And I was anxious.
For nearly half a century, she kept her silence. Elvis Presley's maid lived inside Graceland longer than most, seeing the king of rock and roll in his most private, unguarded moment. She dusted the rooms where he prayed, folded the clothes he wore, and listened as his voice carried through the halls when no one else was there. To the world, Elvis was untouchable, an icon of music, wealth, and fame. But behind the locked gates, he was something else entirely. Restless, troubled, kind, lonely, and haunted by pressures no stage could reveal. For years, she said nothing, out of respect, out of fear, out of grief. But now, 45 years after Elvis's death, she is opening up for the first time. She describes the life behind Graceland's closed doors, the laughter, the sadness, the late-night whispers, and the tragic decline of a man the world thought it knew. What she reveals changes everything. When she first arrived at Graceland, she expected a mansion full of glitter and glamour. What she found instead was a house that felt more like a fortress, grand on the outside, but strangely heavy inside. Elvis had bought Graceland in 1957, at the height of his fame, and by the time she came to work there, the estate had grown into a living museum of his life. The long hallways stretched with velvet drapes and ornate furniture, every corner carrying the scent of cologne, leather, and cigarette smoke. Yet beneath the luxury, there was a sense of tension, as though the walls themselves carried secrets. Her duties were endless: dusting antique, cleaning up after late-night gatherings, keeping Elvis's personal spaces spotless. But nothing about Graceland was ordinary. At times, it was filled with the noise of friends, cousins, and bodyguards, the so-called Memphis Mafia, laughing, talking, and moving through the rooms at all hours of the night. Other times, it felt like a tomb, silent and eerie, with only the sound of Elvis pacing the floor upstairs. She recalled how Elvis would often wander from room to room in the middle of the night, restless, as though searching for something he couldn't quite find. The rules inside the mansion were clear. Privacy was sacred. Certain rooms, especially Elvis's upstairs suite, were off-limits. No one entered unless summoned, and even then, you stepped cautiously. Still, she would sometimes glimpse his shadow moving behind a door, or hear his voice faintly singing to himself. Those were the moments she realized Elvis wasn't just the king adored by millions. He was a man battling the stillness of his own home. And yet, Graceland wasn't without joy. She remembered evenings when Elvis would sit at the piano, calling everyone into the music room to sing gospel hymns until dawn. His voice, unfiltered and raw, would echo through the house like a prayer, and even the staff felt the power of those moments. For her, those nights were reminders that Elvis's true home was not on stage, but in music, surrounded by people he trusted. Still, there was always a sense of isolation. Despite the open doors, the bustling entourage, and the steady stream of visitors, Graceland could feel like a cave. Elvis lived behind gates to escape the screaming fans outside, but within those gates he built walls of his own. For the maid who walked those halls daily, it was clear that Graceland was both a sanctuary and a prison. She witnessed the contrast in ways no one else could. The laughter downstairs, the silence upstairs, and the heavy burden carried by the man who owned it all. Elvis Presley was known to the world as a superstar, but to those who worked close to him, he was something far more complicated, a man whose generosity seemed to know no limits. The maid recalls countless times when Elvis would hand over the keys to a brand new Cadillac, or slip cash into the hands of someone who looked like they needed help. To him, giving was second nature. He bought cars for employees, jewelry for friends, and even paid hospital bills for strangers he had never met. She remembered one evening when Elvis gathered the entire staff together and, without warning, presented them each with a gift, from fur coats to watches, insisting they take it as a token of his appreciation. He never seemed happier than when he was giving something away. But there was another side to this generosity. She saw how people began to expect it, how they hovered around him, not just for his company, but for what he could provide. Elvis's kindness was both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. He was surrounded by people who often saw him as a never-ending fountain of wealth. And though he must have known it, he couldn't stop himself from giving. The maid described times when Elvis would hand out stacks of $100 bills, laughing as he did it, but later retreat to his room, shoulders heavy, as though he realized his generosity could never fill the emptiness inside. To the outside world, Elvis looked like a man who had everything. Inside Graceland, she saw the truth. He was a man who gave everything he could, sometimes at the expense of his own peace. She remembered how he would light up when he surprised someone, how his eyes would sparkle when he saw joy on another person's face. But she also remembered how quickly that light would fade when the crowd was gone and he was left in silence. Elvis's generosity was a reflection of his heart, a heart too big for one man to carry alone. The maid, who had accepted gifts from him herself, understood that these gestures were not just about money or material things. They were Elvis's way of connecting, of showing love, of fighting back against the loneliness that clung to him even when he was surrounded by people. 45 years later, she still remembers the warmth of those moments, but also the sadness hidden behind them. Elvis Presley's love life was the stuff of legend, whispered about in tabloids and speculated on by fans, but for the maid inside Graceland, it was not rumor, it was reality. She saw the late-night visits, the secretive calls, the hurried footsteps of women leaving in the early hours of the morning. Elvis was magnetic, and women seemed to orbit around him as though they had no choice. Some were actresses, some were singers, and others were simply admirers who caught his attention for a moment in time. The maid recalled how Elvis never liked to be alone at night. He filled the empty hours with parties, music, and companionship, sometimes inviting entire groups of people back to Graceland after a show. The house would swell with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the sounds of Elvis holding court, telling stories, singing, and basking in the glow of company. But she also noticed the pattern. Behind the excitement was a man who feared silence, a man who dreaded the stillness of an empty room. She remembered cleaning up after those nights, lipstick-stained glasses, ashtrays overflowing, and the faint trace of perfume lingering in the air long after everyone had gone. To outsiders, it may have looked like decadent, but she saw something else. A man desperately trying to outrun his loneliness. Elvis's relationships were passionate, intense, and often short-lived. He craved connection, but struggled to maintain it. The maid recalled how he could be tender one moment, writing notes and giving gifts, then distant the next, retreating into himself. Women adored him, but she believed few truly understood him. She saw the heartbreak on both sides, his and theirs, as romances sparked brightly and then faded into the shadows of Graceland. The parties themselves often blurred into a routine. Sometimes they were joyful gatherings with music so powerful it shook the wall. Other times, they felt forced, as though Elvis was putting on another performance. Even in his own home, the maid would watch him laugh, dance, and sing, but she knew it wasn't always genuine. When the lights dimmed and the guests left, his eyes often told a different story. The women, the party, the noise, all of it was an attempt to fill a void that nothing ever truly satisfied. For the maid, those nights were proof of the contradiction that defined Elvis Presley, adored by millions, yet profoundly alone. Behind the glimmer of sequined jumpsuits and the roar of packed arenas was a man fighting battles few ever saw. The maid recalls how Elvis's struggle with his health became more visible with each passing year, though most of the world was shielded from the worst of it. She cleaned the pill bottles scattered across nightstands, the prescription slips tucked into drawers, and the half-finished drink meant to ease pain that never seemed to go away. Elvis's body, worn down by years of grueling tours, late night, and an unhealthy lifestyle, was betraying him. Yet he kept pushing himself to perform, to give the audience the king they expected. She remembered nights when Elvis came home drenched in sweat, his face pale, his movements slow and deliberate, as though every step took effort. Sometimes he would collapse into a chair, silent, exhausted, and she would catch glimpses of a man carrying more than his body could handle. Other times, he would retreat upstairs, closing himself off for hours, and the staff knew better than to disturb him. The mood in Graceland shifted constantly. Moments of joy and music often gave way to stretches of darkness where Elvis seemed unreachable. The maid described how he would swing between bursts of energy, laughing with his entourage or showering gifts on those around him, and sudden crushing silences where his eyes looked hollow. The pills were always there, small bottles hidden in plain sight, an attempt to manage pain, anxiety, and insomnia, but she could see how they took their toll. His moods grew unpredictable. His once sharp wit dulled at times, and his body, once strong and athletic, began to carry the weight of years of abuse. She remembered hearing him at night, pacing upstairs, sometimes singing softly to himself, sometimes muttering prayers, fragments of conversations no one else could hear. These were the moments when she realized Elvis was not just the king of rock and roll. He was a man locked in a battle he was slowly losing. The world saw a legend, but inside Graceland, the maid saw a man unraveling under the pressure of being Elvis Presley. She could not intervene, could not change the path he was on, but she carried the memory of those dark struggles with her, long after the lights of Graceland dimmed. If the world believed Graceland was a fairy tale palace, the maid knew it was often the setting for family drama that cut deeper than anyone could imagine. Elvis's life was filled with people who loved him, but also people who depended on him emotionally, financially, and professionally. That dependence created tension, and she saw it play out behind closed doors in ways the public never knew. Arguments between Elvis and Priscilla echoed through the mansion even after their divorce, sometimes soft, private, other times heated and impossible to ignore. They loved one another, she believed, but theirs was a love strained by distance, fame, and expectations no marriage could survive. Then there was Lisa Marie, their daughter, the one person who seemed able to melt Elvis's heart, no matter his mood. The maid recalled tender moments where Elvis would sit on the floor, letting Lisa climb on his back, laughing like he wasn't the king of rock and roll, but just a proud father. Yet even those moments carried shadow. Elvis worried about the example he set, and sometimes his darker moods left him withdrawn, unable to give Lisa the steady father figure he wished to be. Beyond his immediate family, there were the Memphis Mafia, friends who had become fixtures in his life, but who often blurred the line between loyalty and self-interest. The maid heard their whispers, saw their rivalry, and noticed how their influence sometimes fueled Elvis's worst impulse. They protected him, yes, but they also enabled him, and she believed Elvis knew it deep down. His extended family added another layer of complexity. Graceland was never empty, filled with relatives, cousins, and hangers-on who treated the mansion like their own. To them, Elvis was both a loved one and a lifeline, and that pressure weighed on him constantly. The maid remembered nights when Elvis would retreat to his room after arguments, slamming the door, pacing, and muttering about how everyone wanted something from him. At times, he seemed surrounded but utterly alone. These tensions took a toll not only on Elvis, but on the atmosphere of Graceland itself. The house could feel joyful and alive one day, filled with laughter, and heavy and suffocating the next, filled with silence after a fight. For the maid, it was clear that Elvis's greatest battles weren't just against fame or his own health. They were against the strain of family and loyalty, love and disappointment, trust and betrayal. It was within these walls that she saw Elvis not as a legend, but as a man caught between being everything to everyone and struggling to hold himself together. As the summer of 1977 approached, the maid noticed changes in Elvis that chilled her to the core. The man who once commanded stages with boundless energy was now moving slower. His body weighed down not just by age, but by years of exhaustion, health problems, and prescription drugs. She remembered how the house seemed quieter than usual, as though everyone inside sensed something was coming. Elvis still laughed, still sang, still gave glimpses of the vibrant man he had been, but the light in his eyes flickered more often than it shone. He spent long hours upstairs in his private suite, sometimes emerging late at night to wander the halls or play gospel music on the piano, his voice soft and haunting. The staff tiptoed around him, unsure whether they would encounter him in a good mood or lost in silence. His health grew more fragile by the day, his face puffier, his movements stiffer, his speech occasionally slurred. The maid noticed how much he leaned on others to complete even simple tasks, and how often he would retreat to rest between activities that once gave him joy. Still, he pushed himself to keep up the image of the king, rehearsing for performances, making plans, insisting he would soon be stronger. She described how his eating habits worsened, his dependence on medication deepened, and the tension inside Graceland grew thicker with every passing day. Conversations among the staff were hushed. Concerned whispers about whether Elvis could endure much longer. His loved ones tried to reach him, tried to pull him away from the spiral, but he resisted, determined to remain in control of his own life. The maid remembered vividly how even in his most fragile moments, Elvis would flash a smile or crack a joke to ease the worries of those around him, as though he could sense their fear. But she also remembered the emptiness that followed, the weight of silence that seemed to hang over the mansion. For her, those final days were not just about witnessing the decline of a legend. They were about watching a man fight a losing battle against time, against his own body, and against the walls that fame had built around him. The morning of August 16, 1977, is etched into the maid's memory as vividly as though it happened yesterday. She remembered how the air inside Graceland felt unusually heavy that day, as if the house itself knew something was about to change forever. Elvis had stayed up late the night before, restless as usual, moving between his bedroom and the bathroom, flipping through books, and speaking in a low voice that drifted through the upstairs hall. The maid had grown accustomed to his unpredictable hours, but that morning she recalled a silence that felt different, unsettling. Around mid-morning, whispers began spreading through the mansion. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. She remembered hearing hurried footsteps, voices rising in panic, the sound of a phone being dialed frantically. Then the words came, words that froze her where she stood. Elvis had been found, collapsed on the bathroom floor. She could still picture the chaos that followed, the Memphis Mafia rushing upstairs, the frantic cries for help, and the devastating realization that the king of rock and roll was not breathing. She did not see him immediately, but she saw the faces of those who did, pale, shaken, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The maid described how the atmosphere inside Graceland turned surreal, like the entire house had been plunged into a nightmare. She remembered clutching a rag in her hand, unable to move, tears blurring her vision as the sound of sirens grew louder outside. Paramedics rushed in, pushing past staff and family, their voices urgent, their footsteps pounding against the floors she had polished so many times. Elvis was carried out on a stretcher, and in that moment, the maid felt the world shift. The man she had served, the man she had seen laugh, cry, sing, and struggle was gone. The noise outside the gates grew quickly, crowds of fans gathering as news spread like wildfire. But inside, there was only shock, disbelief, and grief so thick it suffocated everyone in the house. The maid remembered the smell of coffee growing cold in the kitchen, the half-finished breakfast that no one touched, the phones ringing endlessly as the outside world demanded answers. She stood in the shadow, watching as those closest to Elvis tried to hold themselves together, their faces streaked with tears. For her, it was not just the death of a legend. It was the loss of a man she had cared for, a man whose humanity she had witnessed when no one else was looking. That morning, August 16, 1977, became the dividing line between before and after. A moment when the music stopped, the laughter faded, and the king of rock and roll became a memory. Even decades later, she could still hear the sound of those sirens, still feel the weight of that silence, still remember the shattering realization that Elvis Presley, larger than life, was gone forever. For decades after that morning in August 1977, the maid carried her memories like a locked chest she could not open. She went about her life quietly, never granting interview, never writing tell-all book, never seeking fame or fortune from the story she alone could tell. Her loyalty to Elvis was unshakable, and for 45 years she lived with the weight of secrets that the world desperately wanted to know. But time has a way of changing things. As the years passed, as those who once crowded Graceland began to fade away, and as the myth of Elvis grew larger than the man himself, she began to feel a responsibility, not to scandalize, not to exploit, but to finally give her testimony, to show the world the truth about who Elvis Presley really was. She explained that the reason she stayed silent was because Elvis trusted her, because he welcomed her into his home and allowed her to see him as no fan ever could. But with so many rumors, so many distortions of his legacy, she decided that the silence had to end. When she finally opened up, what she revealed was not the sordid gossip the tabloids love, but the humanity behind the legend. She spoke of his laugh, the way it could fill a room and disarm even the most tense atmosphere. She spoke of his tenderness, the way he would crouch down to tie his daughter Lisa Marie's shoes or sit with her for hours, reading stories like any ordinary father. She spoke of his generosity, the quiet acts of kindness he performed without cameras or headlines, the countless lives he touched not through music but through compassion. But she also spoke of his struggles, his dependence on pills, his bouts of loneliness that no amount of fame could cure, the way he sometimes looked into the distance as though he wished he could trade places with an ordinary man just for a day. She described the weight he carried, the burden of being Elvis Presley, and how it was a role that demanded more than any human could give. For her, Elvis was not just a star. He was a man of contradiction, capable of immense joy and crushing sadness, a man who belonged to the world but never truly belonged to himself. Breaking her silence after 45 years was not easy. She knew it would stir emotions, reopen old wounds, and invite questions she had long avoided. But she also knew that her story was necessary. She wanted people to understand that Elvis was more than the stage, more than the record, more than the myth that had grown in the years since his passing. He was flesh and blood, fragile and flawed, but filled with a heart so big it often broke under its own weight. In her words, Elvis was not just the king of rock and roll. He was a man who gave everything he had to the world, and in return, the world never let him rest. 45 years later, as she finally speaks, her testimony is not one of scandal, but of truth. The truth that behind the glitter, behind the fame, behind the locked gates of Graceland, there was a man searching for peace, a man who longed to be understood, a man whose music came from both his joy and his pain. And as she reflects on the years she spent in his service, her voice carries both sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for the life cut short. Gratitude for having known the real Elvis Presley. For her, telling this story is not just about remembering the past. It is about ensuring that the world never forgets the man behind the legend.